Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have psychedelic scientist and researcher Manesh join us for a conversation about how psychedelics affect our brain and their effectiveness in therapy. Together, we talk about some of the mythology around psychedelics, your serotonin receptors, and the importance of mindfulness and meditation in creating a positive mental state. Manesh brought so much information to this conversation, and below you will find resources to the studies that he mentions during our conversation, and also to his YouTube channel where he uploads videos if you want to learn more about his work that he's doing. So strap in, I promise it won't be too sciencey. There's a lot of hippie woo-woo, don't worry. Hi, and welcome to the show. So great to have you.
Hey, thanks. It's so nice to be here.
Yes. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. What do you do? What's your background?
Yeah, so I am, third year PhD student studying neuroscience at McGill University in Montreal. I guess you could say my research is looking at, on one side, the default mode network, which is a particular set of brain regions involved in all these interesting functions. And then the other side is looking at how psychedelic drugs work in the brain. And so for that, I collaborate with some researchers over in London at the Imperial College Center for Psychedelic Research. Collaborate with people like Robin Carhart-Harris and another guy named like Leor Roseman and Chris Timmerman, like a group of guys doing psychedelic brain imaging research down there. And so I'm really interested in understanding psychedelics, how they work in the brain, how they can lead to these really, radical, profound experiences that are so kind of divergent from our normal way of functioning, and how they can be used in therapy. And so I kind of combine looking at the default mode network in those to have a better understanding of the processes that underlie kind of our ability to relate and interact with the world.
Okay, that's a lot of information. Let's start with the baby, maybe the 101 of psychedelics. What are they doing on our brain?
Right. So
I know. You got to start way back.
There's a lot of ways to answer that, right? So first let's define what psychedelics are. So the main, when I say psychedelics, I'm mainly referring to LSD, psilocybin, which is a compound in magic mushrooms, and then let's say DMT. And then there's also mescaline and a whole bunch of others, but actually mescaline works slightly different than the other three. So LSD, psilocybin, DMT. And the main way they work is they on a particular brain receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor. And this is a receptor, involved in your serotonin system, and it's distributed throughout your brain, but especially in areas of your cortex, so the more advanced part of your brain, that are the most important, essentially, in regulating the whole brain's activity. So basically, these receptors are located exactly where you need to be to make the most impact on the brain. And it's actually the regions that are also most overlapping with the default mode network, which I could describe after. And so psychedelics, you take them. Let's just talk about LSD just as an example. So you take LSD and it activates this receptor and many others, but this receptor is the most important. And at the level of the brain, it induces a number of things. So one, it seems to make the brain more interconnected. So if we think of the brain as a collection of different regions, they start talking to each other and interacting with each other in ways they weren't doing before, in a way that's consistent with just like more communication being shared. We can say that very kind of simplistically and broadly, but that's the case. And then in addition to becoming more connected, they become more what's called entropic, or more unpredictable in their activity. So if we think about it, in order to have this stable perception of the world and kind of inhabit a world of some kind of order and stability, we need to have brain patterns stay within a particular range, right? Because if your brain is going in all directions all the time, it's just going to be craziness. And so you need it to be constrained in order to survive. But psychedelics make it less constrained. So now you're entering in all sorts of these brain states and mental states that you're usually not entering into. And that's how you're able to escape your kind of tunnel vision that you live your life through and have these radical experiences. So activates the 2A receptor, more interconnected, more entropic. And then the third one I can add, a last one for now, it also boosts neuroplasticity in the brain. So it gives you, we can understand that as it gives your brain cells or neurons more resources to make new connections between each other, and also reorganize and kind of alter existing ones. So we put into this interconnected state with greater entropy and complexity, and then you're able to have resources to create long-lasting changes in your brain as well.
Okay, a lot to unpack there as well. I want to go even a little bit further. So the serotonin receptor, what is going on there? Is it kind of like an SSRI where it blocks the reuptake, or what? How does this work? I've taken organic chemistry and biochem, so I have some working fundamental understanding, but not enough. But I would like to know more about like how it actually works in that receptor.
For sure, for sure. So SSRIs, yeah, they're reuptake inhibitors, so they
Mm-hmm.
prevent serotonin from being, kind of cleared from the synapse. So it's like it's active for longer periods.
Right.
But psychedelics are very different. They actually act as if they're serotonin and directly target the receptors.
Mm.
So they don't necessarily increase serotonin in the brain. So actually evidence showing that they decrease serotonin in certain parts of the brain, in the cortex especially. But rather than that, they're acting as if they're serotonin and activating these receptors. And actually activating the receptor is slightly different than serotonin does.
So if someone takes SSRIs, do they have a different time on psychedelics then?
So SSRIs, because they increase the amount of serotonin available at synapses,
Uh-huh.
that serotonin actually competes with the psychedelic drug. So if you're
Mm.
on an SSRI, it dulls the effects of psychedelics.
Oh, interesting. Just because there's not as many receptors there that are able to take the psychedelic compounds in your
Exactly. It's
brain.
competing with the serotonin. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. So how is it different than serotonin? Why is it such a different? I mean, that's a hard question, I guess, huh? We don't really know all of how
It
and
would get
why.
very technical fast.
Yeah.
But like we could say that it activates different cellular mechanisms in the neuron.
Mm.
So like when serotonin or anything hits a receptor and activates it, what that does, it leads to changes within the neuron, different chemical pathways and so on. And so when serotonin does it, it activates different intracellular pathways
Hmm.
than psychedelics.
Okay.
But like again, this is kind of at the forefront, so we really don't know that much at this level.
Mm. Do we know what exactly gives it the hallucinogenic properties? I know we know, the actual compound, but do we know how it works or how that
Mhm.
process happens?
It's interesting because there are some drugs which activate the receptor, this two-way
Mhm.
receptor, but don't have psychedelic properties.
Like what?
And like what? I won't be able to give you a name, but they're like very experimental kind of drugs they use in rats, this kind of
Okay,
thing.
got it.
Not necessarily that they're available to humans, that people would just take. But it gets very technical, and I don't know the details of the intracellular pharmacology, to be
Mhm.
honest. There's something called beta arrestin, which is something that seems to be specific to psychedelic two-way agonists as opposed to non-psychedelic two-way agonists.
Okay.
But again, this is like stuff coming out right now on
Mm.
characterizing this stuff. So it's very little known, and it's hard to carry out these studies, right?
Right. Because
Because if you do it in rats and not humans, and you have to basically, it involves to know whether the way it's affecting the receptor in rats. It involves these very elaborate studies of opening up their brains and so on. And yeah, it's just like it's very hard to get funding for, and it's like it's not the easiest research to do. And there's only a handful of researchers who are doing it these days.
which is so sad to me just to see that we have such a powerful substance available and we don't know enough of all of its properties, how it works, and what sort of benefit in medicine we could have from this, because there's
Yeah.
just so much that needs to be done on that front of studying it and understanding more. And yeah, what could we unlock in terms of knowledge about the brain if we could figure this sort of stuff out?
Yeah, and research is ongoing, and like I think we know we know very little because like in rats, it's kind of crazy. The psychedelic experience in rats
Mm-hmm.
is measured in terms of how much they twitch their head. It's called the head twitch response, and it's because consistently when you give them a psychedelic, LSD, psilocybin, whatever, they kind of twitch their head a lot more, and then that's supposed to index psychedelic drug effects. And then they use rats in these kind of elaborate models to say, oh, this is a depressed rat, and give it a psychedelic, and it's not performing this behavior, therefore it's not depressed. And then when you generalize up to a human, it's like depression is this complex disorder that could take so many different types, and there's a whole psychological experiential component to it, right? And obviously the psychedelic experience, we don't measure that in people twitching their head. It's like extremely complex internal experience, right? So
Right.
stuff like that makes this kind of rat studies very difficult as well, because you don't know you really don't know the behavioral effects. You don't know if they're tripping or not even. It's just like, when I said like there's 2A agonists that don't produce a trip, it's because they don't produce the head twitch response in rats.
Wow.
So this is what I mean. It's like, it's very hard.
Interesting. I mean, my question would be how, and this is maybe more of a basic question of how do we know the rats have a brain that's as similar to us in terms of like the ability to see hallucinations and other pieces like that? Do we know that?
We don't know.
Yeah.
We just know that they have the receptor for it, and
They
it's
do,
located in
okay.
particular regions, and it becomes activated.
Yeah.
We can't say anything about their experience.
Right, of course, because we can't talk to rats. First off, hope that they're not having a bad trip, and that's what the head twitch is, just like a really bad rat nightmare.
Yeah, who knows, right? Yeah, I don't know. It makes me, like take enough acid with the rat and you'll get into experience or something.
True, then maybe they could speak to you then and we could actually have this full discourse.
That might be the way, yeah.
I've unlocked the secret.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating that we just don't know this stuff. But I don't know what other sciencey level conversations that you feel like people would benefit from understanding of psychedelics. Obviously a lot of people aren't going to become neuroscientists, so that's not necessarily the point. But I do think it's important to talk about like the basic chemistry of this.
I mean, I could talk about one of the latest theories on what the serotonin 2A receptor is for.
Sure, let's hear it.
Because, why does it exist? It didn't exist so we could take mushrooms and trip, right?
Yeah.
It existed for something else. And so the idea is that, to describe this, I've described two different receptors in the serotonin system. The two most common serotonin receptors in the brain are the serotonin 1A and the serotonin 2A. And so the 1A is actually more relevant for SSRIs, and it's a simplification, but when you activate the 1A receptor, it reduces neural activity.
I was actually reading something that was talking about that in the amygdala.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So like the more serotonin you have that activates the 1A receptor, it dampens activity. This is why you take an SSRI, for example, and partially, so like to get back to the theory about that. So the 1A, the idea is that it evolved in order to create a system to allow us to passively cope with stress. And so the idea is when you're in this really stressful life circumstance or experience, serotonin levels actually go up. So serotonins rise in response to stress. As they rise, they'll first hit the serotonin 1A receptor. And what this receptor would do is dampen activity and kind of chill us out, reduce the stress, reduce the amygdala, fear response, whatever. We're just kind of calm, grounded, and relaxed, and able to just withstand the kind of negative experience that you're in. But the thing is, you're not actively taking a role to try to relieve yourself of it. You're just, coping with it. So it's just passive coping. So that's the 1A receptor. And the idea is that the 2A receptor only comes online when your stress gets extremely high, when you're kind of, you just you got out of a 5-year relationship, and then you went to work, you got fired from work, and then you had a flat tire on the way home. And then, you're like this like maximum stress kind of thing. And then your serotonin levels get very high, and then the 2A receptor gets activated. And what the 2A receptor might be for, or it was proposed to be for, is kind of mobilizing more in a kind of active, dynamic response to the issue. Basically meaning that it puts you in a state where now you're kind of like hyper aware, and you're like, oh, I need to do anything it takes to get out of this. And like your mind is more flexible, and like your assumptions and beliefs might be less strong, and you're kind of like, anything goes, I'll do anything to get out of this. I'm not constrained by my past in this moment, and I'm just going to do whatever it takes. And people, you could say people experience this as like the dark night of the soul, where they feel like the rug's being taken out of beneath them, and they lost all structure in their life, and they're like, I don't even know who I am anymore or what's going on. You could say that this might be related to the 2A receptor system being activated. It's kind of a way of reshuffling and reorganizing the system to change, because that's what's really needed in that state.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm following. So the 1A receptor, 2A receptor, both serotonin. So then why does the 2A receptor just become active randomly in that state of stress? Is there something like blocking that synapse otherwise until like higher levels of cortisol or something?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Serotonin has greater affinity for the 1A. So that means the 1A is more sticky. And so then, when they're pretty low to medium levels, it's just going to 1A, it's not going to 2A yet. But once serotonin levels get higher and the 1A is kind of saturated, so it's going into 2A, and then that comes online.
Okay. Interesting. So drugs that might flood our system with an abundance of serotonin then are filling up all the 1A receptors, and now there's a ton left over that they can go to the less sticky 2A receptor.
Yeah, exactly. Like MDMA, for example, you're getting a big boost of serotonin and it's activating these receptors, but not in response to stress. So it's a kind of way of hacking the system, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then when you have that level, then you're more introspective, interested in
Flexible in
taking,
your thinking. Yeah.
yeah, wanting to take action.
Hmm.
Fascinating. Okay, and why is this a theory and not yet? Like we just don't know.
It's because the literature, the research is so like complex, and there's
Mhm.
the studies that that theory is based on also has a number of studies which like go in the opposite direction and
Uh,
conflict. But then you have to get into the really nitty gritty of how experiments were conducted. Was this reliable
mm,
research? Was it this? Was it that?
right.
The serotonin literature is so massive and complex that it's hard to say,
Interesting.
but
Are
there
there
is a
any
lot of work supporting it.
Yeah, are there any other main theories that are kind of in competition to it?
Not in particular to the 2A receptor, but a lot
Mhm.
of understanding around the serotonin system is as a system that regulates stress.
Mhm.
Because when your serotonin is depleted, you're more impulsive, you're more aggressive, you're more prone to addiction type behavior. You're just kind of irritable and off center, basically. And so when you have higher serotonin, it's a way of kind of dealing with that, regulating that stress, allowing you to not be as aggressive or impulsive and allowing you to continue. And so this model is taking that a step further. It's like when your
Mm.
stress gets so intense that you can't just passively sit there anymore, it has to activate this whole new system in order to kind of flexibly and adaptively deal with what's going on. And the idea is that, again, psychedelics activate these receptors directly in the absence of any kind of stressor.
Hmm. 'Cause otherwise they're just sitting there kinda dormant.
Yeah, I think the 2A only comes on like very extreme situations. So it wouldn't
Mm.
happen in your regular day-to-day functioning.
Yeah.
But let's say, yeah, you're going through a very tough time. And let's say you put your whole life into a relationship and you're like, who you were was that relationship. You got so enmeshed and intertwined. Then when you kind of got out of that and you're just on your own now, and
Mm.
you're like, oh, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what's going on. And when you're in that place, you're kind of you're very vulnerable. And because you're just looking for something to grasp onto.
Mhm.
And also, but at the same time, you're very flexible in what you can latch onto.
Yeah, that's
Like your
true.
brain, your mindset hasn't crystallized into a particular model of yourself in the world yet.
Mm.
Therefore, you can choose so many different directions and you're so influenceable, just like when you're in a psychedelic experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, people change so much after those big life
Hmm.
things that are stressful and you take a whole new direction. That would make a lot of sense if that's our understanding of our brain, that we have these receptors that tap into this sort of behavior when we do get pushed to that level. And that could make a ton of sense. It
Exactly.
also could explain people when they talk about taking psychedelics, how they're going in searching for a kind of like a grounding, a rethinking of their life, a different perspective, which then, yeah, that could explain, here's your 2A receptor pushing you into that space that's not in a true danger stress way.
Hmm. Hmm. Totally. So basically, that's the thinking, and what is referred to in the paper is that these states where you're able to kind of question everything again and kind of reshape your life in a way, they refer to it as a pivotal mental state.
Mm,
And it's pivotal because you can go either in a bad or good direction, to put it simply, because you're very, again, vulnerable, sensitive to what's going on around you. You're kind of in a state of relative chaos and disorder. And it's natural, as a natural tendency as being a human, you want to grasp onto something for certainty.
right.
For example, if you don't stop yourself, you could be straight into another relationship that's maybe abusive or whatever, but you wanted that certainty. Or it could be straight into this ideology or political view that
Mhm.
you just cling on to for your life now because it gives you your identity.
Mhm.
And like, so the idea is like a lot of these kind of like people clinging to something, whether it's ideology, relationship, religion, or whatever. It's a way of avoiding uncertainty, the uncertainty and chaos of not knowing, right?
Mm.
And like psychedelics put you straight into that state, and therefore when you're there, you can have a bad trip, you can be influenced very badly if you do it in the wrong circumstance. But if you do it in the good
Mhm.
one, you can use that flexibility to really make positive changes in your life. And that's kind of what they do in these studies for depression, for example.
And they've seen great results.
Yeah, it's really promising.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about how science has always avoided really all these concepts of emotions, like the hard science and research of just ignoring, like, desire and motivation, more of what we would call psychology. And now it's finally hitting this point where people are starting to think about it more and how drugs like this could really change our whole perspective of how we look at our identity, our mental health, like just so much here is really just waiting to be tapped, I feel like.
Totally. I think one of the big distinctions is that like a standard pharmaceutical drug, they work by altering the chemical balance in your brain. At least that's what
Hmm.
people think they do. We really actually don't even know how they really work. But the idea is like you take this and you don't have to do anything yourself. It just magically works under the hood of your brain and you feel better.
Mm.
Whereas with psychedelics, it's like, it's not it, right? You have to take an active role in your
Yeah.
process and actually do the work and go through this psychological experience that you could use to derive benefit, right? But again, only if you approach it with a sense of like surrender and courage that, courage is required for that surrender and kind of a ability to see what you need to see and work through what you need to work through. And that makes it very different than standard drugs because you can't just give it to somebody and put them in a room by themselves and like, yeah, you'll get better after,
No.
right?
Yeah, no.
That's kind of what they tried in the 60s, for example, with some studies. They're like, yeah, if the drug works, then we can eliminate all other factors, strap them to a chair, give them 300 micrograms of LSD, and they'll get better. And
Mm.
literally, they did this, and obviously, they didn't get better.
But it makes sense. They'd want to do it because then you have a control group,
Yeah, exactly.
something truly we can show that it's just the med. And then, yeah, that's not going to be possible. Locking someone with a ton of acid in a room by themselves with no other stimulus is terrifying.
Yeah, and it's a huge tension these days too, because the whole idea of showing a drug's efficacy is
Mm.
showing that is removing all extraneous factors, just the drug, and
Right.
is it better than
Exactly.
placebo? But you
Exactly.
can't do that with psychedelics because the placebo and the expectancy in the set are like essential, parts of it. So, and
Wow.
it's a real
Yeah.
problem that's discussed a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, because you couldn't give someone a sugar pill. They'd know they got the placebo. Like, yeah, how do you even begin to create a placebo group for this sort of thing?
Yeah, and the thing is, studies do it. They just put them in they do placebo and psychedelic, but like everybody knows,
Everyone knows. Yeah.
like if you're getting, the equivalent of 4 grams of mushrooms versus placebo, there's no guessing involved whether you got it or not, right? It's
Exactly,
like,
because you would know.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, well then let's talk about that too. I'm sure there's a lot of people who might be listening who have never had psychedelics.
yeah,
What is the actual experience like physiologically? What do people typically feel? Could you talk about those sorts of things as
yeah,
well?
for sure. So I could speak. Let's talk about, I guess, psilocybin. Psilocybin and LSD are very similar, but
Hmm.
psilocybin is shorter. So psilocybin is usually anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 8 at the longer end, hours long.
Hmm.
So you get like a set of physiological effects and then like subjective psychological. Like physiological, it's like more like at the beginning, you may feel a bit of transient anxiety, kind of tension in your body. Your palms might be sweaty. Depending on how you took it, if you ate them as mushrooms, you might have some kind of nausea and like,
Hmm.
a bit of a stomach ache. But like overall studies have actually shown that increases to blood pressure and other basically physiological responses are very minimal. They're not
Hmm.
significantly increased, if you do it in a controlled setting. And
Hmm.
then subjectively, there's kind of a time course of effect. So it's like you have the come up and then you peak and then you slowly come down, very simplistically.
Hmm.
In terms of the effects, you can separate it perhaps into, if you want to be kind of scientific about it, into 4 different components. So it
Hmm.
changes your thinking, your perception, your emotions, and your sense of self. Perception, visually, you might see patterns in things might blur together a bit. It really
Hmm.
depends how much you took. Colors might be a bit more vivid. In terms of sounds, you might be able to parse the different various sounds in your environment and see the depth and layers of the sounds. Your sense of touch might be enhanced as well,
Hmm.
and smell, taste, anything. So basically, your senses are kind of amplified and blown wide open, and you increase the amount of sensory information you could take in. And then thinking, various things can happen to your thinking, of course, but we could say it's consistent with like kind of thinking becomes more unconstrained. It might not be as logical and linear as usual. It kind of hops from here to here. You see crazy, bizarre connections between things that don't really make sense, but for some reason you see the connection between them. You know, it allows you to kind of break free out of the need to be reasonable and logical and rational. And you can just kind of have this dreamlike state of thinking where like you're just hopping all over the place and it's kind of bizarre. And then emotion, you can be very emotionally sensitive to things. Your empathy can be increased. Your emotion can kind of switch from extreme positives to extreme negatives to this, to that, you know, very easily, especially at higher doses. So there's kind of this emotional volatility. But on the other side, like, you know, you can experience the most blissful, joyous feelings of your life and really appreciate music more than you ever had and have it like, you know, have burst into tears on how beautiful a piece of music is or a flower or whatever, right? But you can also go into very fear and panic, anxiety states too, if you're not responsible. And so that was perception, thinking, and emotion. And then sense of self is an interesting one because it could change your sense of who you are or what you are. So like on the bodily level, your sense of being a distinct body that's limited to this skin and this distinct from the couch you're sitting on and everything else can be kind of blurred, and you just don't know where you end and the couch begins, right? And you just kind of merge with what's around you or other people. If you took a good amount and you're kind of at the peak, you can lose sense of being an individual person that has a past and future. And that's like the you know, the very intense ego dissolution state where you just fully kind of intertwined and merged with everything and there's no sense of identity there. It's kind of like you got launched into this deep yogic meditation, unitive oneness state, you know, without you doing anything. But yeah.
Which is super powerful considering human nature, which is just often very static in how our brain does things. And people get into these patterns and habituations of how they live their life. And here's something that's so incredibly powerful that you have a one-time experience that could really do all of this in just one setting, you know, one moment, which is just absolutely insane. And there's so much here. I feel like one of the favorite questions that I've heard from people is, do you see leprechauns? Do you see little people running when you do these drugs? Is it like, you know, how they show it on TV?
Right. And no, honestly, like if you take, it's not. So like for one, like people call them hallucinogens, right? So that's such like an inaccurate term because one, as I've just described, it goes far beyond that. And then two, to have a full straight up hallucination of something that's not there at all is extremely rare unless you took like, you know, 4 times, 5 times as much as you should have taken. Then maybe you'll have experiences like that. To say that hallucinations of things that are not there at all is a common aspect of the psychedelic experience, it's just not true at all.
Everyone thinks that.
Yeah, because it's media, right? And but what's funny is it originates perhaps in the 60s, where one, you know, the government was trying to scare everyone from using it, but two, people took crazy doses back then.
Really? What were they taking? Do you know?
Like standard tabs were like pure 250 to 300 microgram tabs. So that was a standard dose. In contrast, you know, the majority of studies use 100 micrograms, maybe 200. And I guess most people tripping, I guess kind of a standard person tripping will take 200 max. But they were taking upwards of 300 or maybe even 2 tabs of that much, of like 500 or so that's when you're really activating the system like crazy, and that's when the fundamental structures of your reality can start to cave because you're really in this state where anything goes. And you know, you can enter states where it's like you're in a waking dream, for example, and there's like an intertwinement between your imagination and reality, and you're blurring all distinctions because you're just totally blasted.
Certainly. Yeah, and it's utterly fascinating to me that this psychedelics, LSD, they were not illegal until, what was it, in the 70s?
Yeah, like late 60s.
Yeah, like, I mean, we were doing research with this stuff and actually able to do it, and then just all of a sudden got shut down completely and put in a Schedule 1 drug, which means it has no medicinal value at all. So, and that most addictive. So I don't know if you have any comments on how addictive psychedelics are.
So they're not, you can't be
exactly
completely dependent on, right? There's no addictive forms. Like, and if you have a full-blown psychedelic experience, like you're not really going to want to do it the next day, at least if you're a normal person. And it's not something that lends itself to like wanting to do all the time. And actually, if you give it to rats and try to get them to, like if you give them cocaine, they're going to keep administering over and over and over and over again. If you give them the
Right.
psychedelics, it's actually aversive. They'll like stay the hell away from it after a while.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think if they don't enjoy tripping. But
Wow. I
yeah,
mean, makes sense. They're just head twitching all day. Like I wouldn't want to do that either,
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, from a pure science standpoint, it shows that it's not addictive. So I don't understand how it's still in that category. I think a lot of people probably have that question, and it's politics, right,
Yeah,
is the answer.
yeah, I think it will change soon with when more and more studies coming out. And if psilocybin is to be made a kind of available medicine for psychiatrists,
Mm-hmm.
it has to change. The scheduling has to change at some point. And
Right. There's a whole group of people that are, or I guess everybody, Jesus, a lot of people are still very afraid of psychedelics.
mhm.
And I think that a lot of that was connected to the 70s and that whole movement of criminalization of this drug and all of that. And now here we are, people are afraid to take it because they think they're going to see a leprechaun. And there's been this hype and this whole, like, I don't even know story to really what psychedelics are, I feel like.
Yeah, totally. And some of it is kind of warranted of in terms of using it irresponsibly. It could put
Yeah.
you in crazy experiences, right?
Yes.
Uh, and I feel like a lot of the research these days actually downplays the risk for people doing it at home.
Ooh.
Because a lot of the research is done in such a controlled context. You have two therapists next to
Mhm.
you holding your hand. You're in this nice room, there's medical professionals around you. And so you're really able to go deep into it. Whereas if somebody's just taking it at home and let's say they live in a kind of sketchier neighborhood or something and they go for a walk, that's a recipe for disaster. Or the
Mm.
people around them are going to like mess with them, or they don't really trust who's around them. They feel judged. That could put you in a very, not a fun headspace. But at the same time, it's not like you take it and you're psychotic and you're going to be tied up somewhere, right? That's definitely not true. And it really
Yeah,
depends on the context and, the set and setting, as they call it. But
for sure. I feel like most people say that they're just afraid that they're going to not be able to control themselves,
mhm.
is what I hear a lot.
Yes. And I mean, this is why you should do it in a controlled setting,
Right. Right. And
Uh,
I mean, you said surrender too at the beginning. You were talking about that. And I think that's a big thing with drugs that can affect your mental state so much. There is a level of, you don't have the same control that you did before. It's just it's a different mental state. So there is a lot of surrender to that change that has to happen. And if you try to hold on to your previous mental state, you're really going to panic because you're not in that one right now. You know what I mean?
exactly. You have to go through the door. You can't be holding onto the sides of the door, like
Exactly.
trying to not get in there, right?
Right. But how do you explain that to people who have never done it? How do you, tell them like you let go, just fall into it, and trust it. And
Yeah.
it's going to be a time and it will end.
That's what they do in the trials for people who've never taken a psychedelic. Let's say,
Oh,
there's trials
yeah.
for people who have a terminal cancer diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're gonna die soon, and they're kind of they're struggling with it. And these are people sometimes in their 50s or 60s, never taken a psychedelic. Now they're taking a high dose psilocybin session,
Wow.
and that's what they tell them. They're like, if it's gonna be a very intense experience, surrender to it. I think they even say in the instructions, if there's a door, open it. If there's anything
Mm,
available, go deeper, 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 and keep following it. And they recommend them to do that. And so I think, surrendering in that way is essential, and it's something they specifically tell them. But again, this is them lying on a couch with eye shades on, listening to music with therapists around them. If you're in a big music festival that's crazy and you just took way
right.
too much acid, then you surrender. Who knows where you're going to end up at that point, right? This is why it's so
Right.
dangerous. And
Certainly.
and the loss of control, like, is really dose dependent, right? It depends
Mm,
on how much you took. If you take a smaller amount, you're still very cognizant and present. But like as you get into really higher amounts, it can be like a threshold you hit where
mm-hmm.
then your this sense of self-awareness is gone and you're just kind of in this experience until it's over.
Right.
And that's the scary part, right?
Definitely. And I think it's interesting that some of those same people will say, I'm afraid to do psychedelics because I'm going to lose control, but then they'll also drink. To which I say, hey, that you're going to lose even more control, in my opinion, potentially if you do that. And it's the same sort of concept, right? Of like, if you go past a certain limit,
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
is what's going to happen, regardless, in a lot of different drugs. And I think people forget that alcohol is a drug.
Totally, it is. I mean, just like psychedelics, it acts on particular receptors in your brain, it acts on the
Yes.
GABA receptors, and
Yes.
and once it's in your brain, it's no different, right?
Exactly.
It's just
Yet
another chemical.
exactly, right? But people, I don't know if it's because society has just allowed alcohol to be one of those psychotropic substances that we have that we just allow with no stigma, but people forget it's the same level, and it should, in my personal opinion, be treated the same, of understand that they're both things that will affect your brain in different ways. Like, we shouldn't necessarily stigmatize one or the other. They have
Totally.
benefits, dangers, be responsible.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But I think psychedelics, yeah, it's interesting because if you drink too much alcohol, it'll just dull you out. Where
Mm,
psychedelics will the opposite. You're just in some
yeah.
crazy, crazy experience. But also psychedelics, what kind of makes them perhaps have potential to make a longer impact is, again, they
Yes.
make the brain more plastic, right?
Mm,
Use neuroplasticity so that if you have a very traumatic experience on a psychedelic and it's not resolved during the experience, you will feel that afterwards. You'll kind of be a bit down for a little while, and this has been documented in the
mm,
60s and 70s. Psychiatrist Stan Groff, who's like a very well-known pioneer, kind of led over the number is they say like 4,000 or 5,000 sessions of LSD psychotherapy from the 60s to the mid 70s,
mm-hmm.
and kind of really detailed people's experiences. And he was like, if somebody's in a bad trip space, they have to find that resolution, otherwise it lasts during their day. And he would guide a given person through 10, 20 different sessions and like see how the content that emerges develops, and you're kind of on this journey through from session to session.
Mm,
You take one, and then the next time, even if it's a month later, it kind of picks up where you left off,
mm.
work through it. But if you just like kind of get overwhelmed by this kind of traumatic experience from your childhood coming up while you're at a music festival, you go into a trauma response, and then they give you some kind of tranquilizer and get you out of it, you're going to be, that's going to mess you up because like
Mm,
you didn't find the resolution to that experience, and now you've brought it up, and it can
wow.
actually activate that trauma. And that's
So,
a real thing too. So
so what do people do? Do drugs again? Like, how do you get out of that loop? What do people do once those neural pathways have been open? Do they just fall
right.
away after some time because of the plasticity, or?
They, I mean, it really depends, right? So
Mm,
like perhaps, it's very possible that after a while this fades away. Just like you can have a very positive experience and it'll fade away if you don't integrate it, right?
right.
But if you go into that negative space and then it's kind of reinforced really strongly, and
Mm,
people then you go to a psychiatrist, you're like, oh, like you have bipolar disorder now, and you create that narrative that that's who you are, and then you can see how that can spiral into an identity
right.
when it wasn't really the case. And
Right.
maybe they'll push you on meds because they think you're crazy now, and then you're
Mm,
just like messed up because of the meds, right?
right.
Which is, antipsychotics are not fun. They really, harm a person's ability to think clearly, their sexual functioning, you'll gain weight, you won't be able to feel anything.
Antipsychotics or are all antidepressants is what you're saying?
I mean, they all vary in the degree to which they have side effects, but I think antipsychotics a lot of them are particularly kind of nasty in that respect.
Certainly, yeah, they have a larger effect, but then what do you do if that's the only thing that keeps you functioning, right?
Yeah, but the concern is like prematurely prescribing that,
Oh, certainly. Yeah, prematurely incorrect diagnosis, all of this is super big, right? If, and what you said earlier of labeling, if someone gets a diagnosis that isn't correct, that can create a whole sort of cohesive narrative. And as humans, that's what we like to do. We like to make cohesive narratives out of our life. This is, oh, I have this diagnosis. This is why this happened, which is sometimes true. But if, it wasn't accurate, then it can create a whole different narrative, which can then perpetuate further actions and further understanding of your life and kind of go down a path. But yeah,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, it's just, I would wonder those people who have that psychedelic trip that it goes poorly and then are afraid to get on the horse again, right?
Yeah.
To do it again. And then now it's this whole, oh, psychedelics are really scary. Psychedelics are this. I had a bad trip. I can't ever do it again. But then, yeah, they just kind of wait for that pass, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and I know people who've gone through that exact experience, right? And they
Yeah.
kind of had a very dark experience, and now they can't even go near it because they feel that feeling
Yeah.
coming back, right?
Mm,
But like the way to resolve that is to go with the therapist. But obviously, you can't do this, it's illegal. The way to do it in an ideal sense would be to see a psychiatrist or a mental health practitioner who's trained in psychedelic therapy.
mm,
It's like, hey, I had this negative experience in the past. I know it's going to come up, but I want you to help me resolve it. And I think that could be profoundly healing for somebody to go through.
right.
But it's a very delicate process, and it takes a lot of courage to go back into your bad trip to try to resolve it, because you really need the support if you want to do that.
Certainly. So what do you think a bad trip is then?
I think it takes a variety of forms, right? There's actually a questionnaire that scientists administer called the Challenging Experiences Questionnaire,
Ooh, I like
which is
that.
which is meant to kind of index bad trip phenomena.
I like
And there's
challenge. It's so much healthier. Let's use challenging
exactly,
experience. It's
exactly,
positive.
exactly, because it can be negative, it can be good. Like if you say it's a bad trip, that's kind of, has like obviously it's gonna be bad,
Right.
And so the Challenging Experience Questionnaire, it has 7 components. You can try to remember them. One is a feeling of dread,
Mm.
a feeling of panic, feeling of insanity. Oh, I'm not going to remember the other ones. Anyway, it's like a whole, like the characteristic aspects of a bad trip experience. And
Hmm.
actually, there are some people who have high kind of challenging experiences and still, get a positive benefit, but it
Hmm.
is negatively correlated with positive benefits. So people who
Mm.
have an extremely challenging experience have less positive benefits from it. However,
Yeah.
I would also add to that though. I think, that's a very crude way of saying it because a challenging experience can vary widely. Like, you can have a lot of fear, dread, and feel like you're going crazy
Hmm.
because a traumatic experience of you being abused as a kid came up,
Right.
or you're just with some sketchy people who freaked you out, right?
Yep.
And like in the terms of the trauma part, it's like if you had that come up, but then you work through it and now you got to the other side and you somehow made peace and integrated into your psyche, then
Hmm.
you're likely not going to have negative effects after. But if you're in some sketchy environment and people freak you out and you come out of that, it's like that's going to mess you up a bit. And there was no, resolution in the short term for that.
Certainly. Right. And I mean, I feel like psychedelics seem to illuminate thought patterns. And so if you already have a negative thought pattern that you habitually fall into, then you take a psychedelic and that can become very apparent and happen very fast. And if you can't get yourself out of that negative spiral, say it's anxiety of getting worried of, oh, do these people like me that I'm with? And like, if that
Yeah.
happens on a normal day to day, then you pump your body with this, drug, and now it's going to really show up. And if you can't ground in normal time, grounding when you're on a psychedelic becomes even harder.
Hmm.
But if you are able to kind of recognize that in social settings and ground yourself appropriately, then it's really taking those skills, I feel like, into that experience of recognizing this is a different mental state. We're
Hmm.
gonna, ground ourselves in a different way and calm and then move and redirect our thoughts. A lot of it, I feel like, is this sense of mindfulness.
Exactly. I think, yeah, I guess that's under acknowledged is just how important mindfulness is in
Yeah.
navigating a psychedelic experience. Because, at any point in any experience in your life, you can always just take the stance of a witness, of just watching what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
You might be in the craziest, psychedelic experience, but if you realize, I am not this experience, I'm watching this experience.
Right.
And like, and at another level, all of this is being created within myself. It's all me. And then you're able to take that stance and that kind of, you're like, oh, this is bizarre. What is all this negative, crazy shit being in my mind for?
Mm.
As opposed to, oh, this is so real. This is happening to me. And so I do think mindfulness is essential from distancing yourself from your experience to give yourself a greater control over it. Right.
Certainly. I mean, just listening to you talk about it, it sounds almost identical, right? Thinking about it in that way of, you're moving through your day with mindfulness, you take a step back and kind of recognize how your emotions get pulled, and you can see
Mhm.
your emotions and you don't ignore them, right? You see them, but you recognize that they are not defining of you. They are a part of you. They are this outside thing that I'm looking at from a little bit of distance, and I can choose whether I want to engage with that or not. And in the
Yeah.
same it's exactly what you're talking about with psychedelics of choosing whether to focus down that thought pattern or redirect and refocus. I
Yeah.
wonder if is there research talking about people who are actively mindful and show really high correlations of that with potentially having good trips?
Hmm. I don't think so.
'Cause
Yeah, there are measures out there where you can give them a questionnaire. There's like the 5-factor mindfulness scale.
I wrote a whole yeah, that's
Yeah.
just me. I actually wrote a paper on that very recently for a
Yeah.
class.
Nice,
Yes, so I know
nice.
exactly what you're talking about.
Totally. So that exists, but I don't think it's been administered in the context of a psychedelic study. That'd be
Mm,
interesting. Yeah, maybe the next time when I collect some data with people on psychedelics,
seriously.
I'll get it.
Yeah, do
That'd
that
be
because I
cool.
think that'd be fascinating. Is it really just that? I mean, and don't they put people who do meditate into fMRIs and other scanners and notice that like the areas of the brain that are active are different? And I don't want to say the same areas that light up for hallucinogenics, or is it close or
There,
anything?
there is some overlap. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, we should say that meditation and mindfulness are so complex. There's so many
Oh
different
yeah,
types,
yeah,
etc.
certainly.
But there was one study that got a lot of press and people refer to it a lot. they had reduced activity in their default mode network
Mm.
in meditators. And so default mode network is involved in so many things, but it is involved in kind of our mind wandering and daydreaming and rumination,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of stuff, remembering the past, thinking about the future. And so it makes sense that meditators would reduce activity in this area. But what's interesting is that with psychedelics, you also get reduction in this area, but that can happen at the same time of a crazy psychedelic experience, right? So, so this points to the limitations of just saying default mode network deactivation. That's a whole topic, but there is overlap in these default mode network regions in some way, which is interesting. And there was one study actually where they had people on the Vipassana meditation retreat.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 7-day, and on the fourth day, they gave half the people psilocybin
Mm-hmm.
and half them a placebo. And they found that the people who took the psilocybin, as you might guess, had much more kind of spiritual, mystical experiences and more ego dissolution. They were able to tap into deeper states of meditation that they weren't able to before. And even when they measured these people, I think it was either 4 or 6 weeks later, the people who got the psilocybin and had deeper mystical experiences had greater increases in well-being, like a month later, 6 weeks later.
And this is insane. And the rates of that are higher than frequent drug treatments that we have.
Yeah.
That's nuts. I'm listening to us speak and thinking some people still won't have even gotten past the point of stigma to even hear what we're saying at all, which just breaks my heart that, you try to talk to people about this and they just drug bad. And it's like there really is no discussion of these deeper points of just, wow, what power we have potentially with this substance to just change human existence and our connection to our mental health and others. And just, it's so much that I just get very upset.
Yeah, I think partially, I mean, there's so many things, but I think partially it's because in order to understand or think about psychedelics, you can't be black or white. It's very gray in that, it's not like they're good or bad or they're positive or negative. They are what you make of them. They could be all these things. They could put you in the darkest experience of your life. They can also put you in these blissful, mystical experiences and facilitate behavior change and, help treat depression and all these things. I think you have to really think about them deeply. Otherwise, you either become super, exuberant about them, evangelist about them, or you're like, oh, they're bad drugs, they make you crazy.
Right.
In order to be in that middle ground, which is the most reasonable ground, you actually have to do some thinking.
Certainly.
I think people like to avoid doing some thinking.
Right. And I think it's important to contextualize the other drugs that we have in, because this is also this is also a very Western phenomenon. Not other places in the world do incorporate psychedelics and drugs in a very different context. So this is talking about American culture, right? And then we look at American culture and we have really normalized other drugs. I know we talked about alcohol, but equally another drug that affects people's mental state, coffee. We just find that super fine. You can take coffee all day long, get super anxious or agitated or energetic and have all this energy from a drug, and that's perfectly fine. You can even have a dependence on it, and that's celebrated as your morning cup of coffee. And I drink coffee every day. I love coffee. But it's just interesting to me that then there's this almost imaginary symbolic box of drugs that are not okay. We really don't talk about coffee as a drug. We talk about it as a drink. But there's these class of drugs, which include frequently the big ones, right? LSD, ecstasy, blah, 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 whatever. Those are the drugs that are bad. And then it almost, it becomes this just blanket box of we're not going to talk about those ones. Those are the ones we don't do anything with.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And it is very cultural, right? And especially if you grew up as a kid telling you in elementary when you're a little kid, like, oh, these are bad drugs. And people just, navigate their lives without questioning it. And now, they're in their 30s and they believe their entire life it's a bad drug. And now people are saying, oh, they're using it in therapy. Like, what the hell is that about, right?
Exactly. And we're seeing a little bit of that with cannabis. I mean, cannabis is now coming into this space where people are learning that, wow, there was maybe some good properties here that we just totally ignored. And we're going to have to redefine our stance and perspective on these things.
Yeah, I really do think it's happening with psychedelics.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Especially with Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. I'm not sure if
I haven't heard of it. Yeah, tell me about it.
Really? So it's like a really, it's introduced a lot of people to psychedelics. So Michael Pollan's this nonfiction author. He's written about plants and nutrition, very respected guy. I think he's lectured at Harvard and Berkeley and this kind of thing. And he got into psychedelics because he was fascinated by, basically what we're talking about. Like, he heard about it when he was younger. He's been around it, but he never really knew about it. Now there's this revolution happening in research. The book is kind of both the sociocultural analysis of psychedelics before and now. And he went and tried different psychedelic drugs and talks about his experiences in a very critical, skeptical, very level-headed way. He interviews and interacts with a bunch of leading researchers. It's like a really good book. And I think that really puts psychedelics on the mainstream map because a lot of people respect him. He's not like some guy who came in just for psychedelics, right? He had long history of really good work outside of the field, and like putting that book out there, I think has changed a lot of people's minds. It's funny, it's called How to Change Your Mind, but I think
and he's doing
changed a lot of people's minds with it. So I think that's made a big change. And of course, there's a psychedelic business industry these days with like hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into it, and it's growing so rapidly. Just the fact that I think, two of these companies have over $100 billion market cap, even they're pre-revenue, they're not even making money yet because obviously they're not legal, but that VCs and all these rich bankers are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars, means times are changing, right?
All right. Do you have stock advice? What are the stocks? Where are we going to start putting our money?
Right. There's a lot of resources on that online. So
certainly. Yeah. I mean, it's changing. That's why I wanted to have you on the show. That's why I want to open up dialogues about this, because I think there's still just such a lack of real conversation about what these experiences are, and doing it in a professional and not, I don't like, not a drug lore way of just, play drugs, but like really talking about the good, the bad, the dangers, and the benefits of it. I think that's a very healthy conversation way to look at it. You also, you're in an academic field too. And it seems potentially like, science has been doing this since the 50s, 60s. So maybe there's less of a stigma there in your field, or do you feel like there's still a stigma to be studying and talking about these things?
There is somewhat. Like I work in the Montreal Neurological Institute, which is it's like the biggest neuroscience institute in Canada and one of the biggest in North America. And it's a bit more like mainstream conservative, you could say. And I think most people are open and curious, but also regarded as fringe to some degree. It's unfortunate because some researchers will say stuff like, it's so complex. How can you control for all the factors? So, subjective the experiences, and say like, then they're not really, valid objects of scientific study. But then it's like, these things are fascinating. And the fact that they're kind of escaping typical methodologies means you just have to be more creative and find ways to study them, not even look at them because they challenge our paradigms.
Yeah. Don't be intimidated by the challenge. Let's rise up to it. Let's find it. Let's find that study, that could do this.
Yeah, exactly. But like a lot of it is reputation, because reputation is like academia is so political, right? And reputation matters. So if you're labeled, especially as an early researcher, as fringe, and people just assume you're like a bad scientist, or you're weird, or you're unbiased or something, and that can really, impact your ability to get a job, to get things. So
do you get any negative feedback when you reach out to people and tell them what you do? Do you feel judged? No? Okay.
No. So for me, it's all positive. There is some kind of hesitance sometimes, even with my research supervisor, because he's totally non-psychedelic, and I just kind of bring psychedelics into the lab. And he's kind of become more open to it. But he's very hesitant, again, because reputation management, right? But I think times are changing, and any reasonable person, especially a scientist, if you show them, it's like, hey, read this review paper, look at these research papers, you're going to be like, there's something here.
Yeah.
And recently, there was a study comparing psilocybin to escitalopram, which is a standard SSRI.
Right.
That was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like the most high impact medical journal in the world. It's like science. It's like better than Nature, but for medicine kind of thing. For it to be in that highly esteemed journal means it's going to be read by doctors all around the world and taken seriously, right? So I think that's huge as well.
Right, definitely. How do we support the work? How do we, I like to include pieces of activism on my show for people that do find some of these topics something that they want to support in their lives some way. Are there any resources or avenues that you would say people could get involved?
Yeah. I know there are a lot of survey studies that researchers do online. If you tried a psychedelic, sometimes not even if you did try it, just collecting different data on people to get in a sense of just like the population level use tendencies or whatever. Definitely looking into that. in terms of specific resources,
Mm-hmm.
you can look into Johns Hopkins University and in Imperial College London. If you just like go on their websites and find the Psychedelic Research Center website, there will definitely be links to take part in different research studies, which you can just do from home.
Yeah.
So that's one way. Another way is like the main impediment to psychedelic research these days is not approval from regulatory, not getting regulatory approval or ethics.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually funding.
Mm.
So like government agencies will approve psychedelic research, but they're not yet really funding it.
Hmm.
And psychedelic studies are expensive because you got to buy these drugs. You have to have psychiatrists on board who's there, 2 psychiatrists for 8 hours for one person a lot of the time, adds up. And so a lot of studies are either funded by philanthropy, like big rich people like Tim Ferriss or whatever, donating millions of dollars, or like, the first brain imaging study on LSD was crowdfunded because there's no other way to get funding. So basically the thought there is like, if you're rich, know somebody who's rich, get them, educate them about psychedelics, donate to something like MAPS or USONA, these nonprofits.
MAPS. So what recommendations would you have for someone who is open and curious to a lot of the stuff that we talked about today?
Right. So I wouldn't advocate for doing illegal drugs, but there are places in the world where it is legal.
Mm-hmm.
In the Netherlands, for example, there's places like the Synthesis Institute where you can go on a treat and take some mushroom truffles.
What?
Yeah, there's like fully legal retreat centers in the Netherlands to do it, and Synthesis is the main one. And I believe Oregon passed a bill to decriminalize psychedelics, not even decriminalize, allow them to be used in a therapeutic setting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not active yet, but I think it's sometime in the next year or two, they'll have centers where people can go, I believe, without a disorder of some sort and have a psychedelic trip.
Mm-hmm.
Might be a bit expensive, but that's available. Also, Jamaica, psilocybin mushrooms are legal in Jamaica, and there
Really?
are retreat centers out there. Yeah.
Wow.
So you could go down there. And I'm not sure the status for ayahuasca. I'm sure some South American countries, if you do it in a religious context, it's not against the law.
Mm-hmm.
This must be the case in Brazil or Peru, because there's a lot of retreat centers down there.
Mm-hmm.
But there are places, if you're resourceful and willing to travel a bit and make that, go on a physical journey in addition to the psychological journey, I think there
Definitely.
are ways to do it.
There's a lot people could learn by taking those trips and going out and, expanding their consciousness and getting out of you're in Canada, but this little Western American bubble that we have, and just learning about different experiences, different relations to drugs. There's so many different cultural pieces here that you could unlock by going to a different location and learning more about yourself and how other people relate to the drug.
Totally. And
Yeah.
and it's totally worth it, but at the same time, be very careful of where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of places, especially, in foreign countries, they're just trying to scam these Westerners who want to, have an authentic shamanic experience, and they just pretend the whole way and then, steal their money or worse, right?
Right.
So like definitely there are a lot of websites which catalog retreat centers internationally and with ratings and reviews, and make sure you know where you're going, where you're getting yourself into, and always maintain kind of, a skeptical eye and kind of don't be too naive around it.
Certainly. And one of the last things I always like to ask everyone on the show is one thing that they would like to normalize. And it could be anything. I like to present it as, something personal to you that is important, that you wish other humans just knew was more of a normal experience.
Basically, normalize people's innate ability to work through their issues themselves, kind of empowering people to have the ability to take an active role in their mental health. That's what it comes down to. Instead of needing to outsource it to drugs or even therapists, it's just like, starting a meditation practice, journaling, analyzing your patterns, introspecting, creating some kind of internal practice with yourself, taking an active process in how you're doing instead of outsourcing it.
Certainly. And I think, from my perspective, even the outsourcing should be done in combo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like if you are seeing a therapist or doing those things, also incorporating this individual aspect of internal work. And that is the work, right? But I think what you're talking to about is very powerful in the sense of, I think if I'm understanding correctly, what you're trying to hit is the autonomy piece of this, is that we can take a active role in changing our mental state. It's not just
Yes.
something of talking to someone and that talking will necessarily project change. It's taking active steps of reflecting, learning, and using your autonomy with your own mental state to bring about change.
Exactly. No, that's exactly it. Basically, taking upon yourself to analyze and understand yourself,
Yeah.
and to really just go inside and like, what are my tendencies in behaving and acting and thinking? Where do they come from? Am I happy with them?
Mhm.
Am I in integrity with my values?
Right.
Why not if I'm not? And how can I change that? And where does it come from? There's so many questions you can ask yourself and make big progress in just living a more conscious, aware, integrated, harmonious, happy, life. And yeah, and you made a good point that it shouldn't, it can happen, it could very well complement therapy and other things you're
Mhm.
doing, but it's like not making that the only thing where you're dependent on something external.
Certainly. And, there's a lot of people who can't afford therapy. And so then if I'd want to say we should all be doing that. That is all what we should be doing. We should all be looking introspective and thinking about how can we better, where can we grow, what are areas we want to change? Is this cohesive with my values? And then if you have therapy, there's that person that you can talk about it with. So like, yeah, everyone, I want everyone to do this, whether you have
Yeah.
therapy or not. What is this? This is a level of connecting to yourself, your
Yeah.
listening to your inner value system and living out that life and really taking active steps. I mean, that would be the magical formula to all of a good life, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's crazy that a lot of people don't automatically do that.
Mm,
This is kind of why I wanted to bring it up, because it should, in my mind, be an essential part of any education of any child, for example, to
mhm.
instill these values and practices and techniques. But we don't have that. It's like, oh, I feel bad, I need to go to the doctor, or I need to take this drug, or I need to go somewhere else and find out, need somebody else to help me. And I feel like that's a baseline way a lot of people operate, and never taking the time to sit with themselves and analyze in an introspective way.
Okay, so how did you get to this space then? What do you think made you the person that is so introspective? Was it an experience? Was this something you always did?
I think partially it's personality. Like,
Mm,
I think some people are more predisposed to be like that than not. And like in my late teens and stuff, I was a big reader. So I would read a lot on Eastern philosophy and spirituality and meditation and this kind of stuff. And it's really a lot of, and self-help, self-development, this whole
mhm.
thing. And it's really kind of showed me kind of how we perceive ourselves, and reality creates our reality, and that we can change that. And we can change that through meditating, through
Mhm.
working through our issues, being honest and real with ourselves, and all these things. And just seeing how in myself, how I've transformed over the last 10 years or whatever, and just seeing what's possible there, and then seeing people who are still the way they were when they were 18, and not really, and just
Mhm.
running from their issues and hiding them, in whatever way they can, just because on one side they don't know how to deal with it, and it's just not taught, and people aren't told that they can, and that it's possible, and that they're, yeah, that they're just able to do it. And I think
Right.
that's a large portion. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I could probably talk about that forever because ultimately that's just the concept of people get stuck in these habits thinking they are, I feel like who they are and they are. And it's almost like this concept that we're solidified and that we can't change. And I feel like I see a lot of that of just feeling like you're stuck living this pattern that has become who you are and learning that, wait, I can change that pattern now. And literally in this exact moment, I have the ability to do that, which
Hmm.
sounds very hippie woo woo. I feel like a spiritual coach person to come out and be like, you can do change now. But like,
Yeah.
damn it, that's the message. Like, right? Like you have the power. And it's like, I want people to see that. And that's $1 million question. How do we help other people see that power?
Yeah. And one of the things that psychedelics can do is, or just by reading about psychedelics and how they can help people change, tells people that it's possible, right?
Mm,
Because there's so many people, even in there, like I'm 27, and let's say I've seen people 27, 28, kind of acting like, oh, this is it, this is who I am now, my life, I've hit where I'm going to hit, and I'm just going to stay at this level. That scares the hell out of me. Like,
yeah.
I'm barely beginning my life journey and of growth and change, right? But
Hmm.
a lot of people are just like, yeah, they get stuck into their habitual way of doing things and their model of who they are, their ego identity, and they like it. It's comfortable, it's secure, and they just
Right.
stay in that place. And I guess there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but it's this very limiting way of living. And I think psychedelics, just not even taking them, just seeing how they can lead these people who are in their 40s to the 50s to make these big changes and reflect on their life in a new way, suggest the plasticity of our minds if we allow ourselves to go there.
And I love this topic because my head is saying, well, I'm supposed to figure out who I am. Like society really pushes that on you that you should know who you are. You should know who you are. Like, how do you not know who you are? Which I think what you're kind of talking about is we are constantly moving. We're constantly changing. We are never static. Yet, like,
Yeah.
we get this message that we should know. And I don't know if that's kind of like just this culture of, the career capitalist kind of structure that says you need to know what you want to do with the rest of your life. And that's going to define you. You need to know now. And you have to know when you go to college. You have to know when you get out what job you want. And like, yada, yada, these pieces that try to say, like, we're going to make these definitive things that stay forever. But it's fascinating to almost like at the same time of that level of wanting to be open to change, society tells us that we should know. And I guess
Yeah.
maybe there is some in between there where you kind of like know your core values, but who you are kind of, it doesn't go a black and white switch, but maybe it just takes on different like shapes. I don't know. I'm like moving my hands trying to feel like this would maybe like
Yeah. No,
explore.
totally. I think it makes sense to have a kind of a core. And in some sense, you have a core. You have your
Yeah.
personality and who you are at the deepest level, and that's not really going to change that much. But like so much can change around that, right? With varying degrees of how healthy it is and how open and expansive it is, as opposed to contracted and fear-based.
Right.
I think a lot of it is letting go of fear, because fear is what creates rigidity. Because if you're scared and you need something to not feel scared, then you're going to cling on to it. But if you're consciously choosing, what you're taking on, and you're not clinging onto it for your sense of worthiness or identity, or you need to survive, then life is so much much more free and open. You're this dynamic organism that's constantly adapting and growing and changing. That's what being a human should be, right? Not being a robot automaton who, even though we have this gift of self-awareness and conscious action, just throwing that aside and living in our habits, which is most people, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, our whole structure, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, it's a life. It's a pattern. It's a structure. You can get very stuck in it. Yeah, fear is such a big thing that I think prevents so much human activity. Fear prevents connection. We're afraid to be our vulnerable, authentic selves. We're afraid to try these new experiences, so we stay stuck. We're afraid to take on a new identity because what does that mean about the old one? I mean, fear is a big thing, which is why I think it's fascinating that they're doing those ketamine-assisted psychotherapy trials, which, with very traumatic things, maybe we can dampen this fear response and really talk and open up and create some sort of exploration around these things. But frequently, fear is such a strong human biological response that really can prevent us from so much.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just be Alex Honnold one day and like be rock climbing off the side of a rock with no fear response in my amygdala. But
Right.
I
But
hope
like,
that's not what it takes to be conscious.
yeah, no, I think there's distinction there, right? There's like fear, like of your physical safety, that is valid. But then there's
Yeah.
psychological fear of something that doesn't actually, you're not at risk for your life. It's not a real fear.
But didn't they do research that said that the brain responds directly in the same area as if it's the same
It
experience?
does. It is the same in the brain, but the
I
thing is,
know.
I think it is exactly the same, but that's the bad thing. That's why you assume that this psychological fear of, oh, like, what if I talk to this person and they reject me, is the same as what if they like chop my head off almost.
Literally. Well, that's what our brain is saying.
Yeah.
So then how do you politely tell the brain that it's wrong? Like how do you
For
say,
me, what it
yeah.
is letting go.
Mm,
Because whatever you give attention to will amplify and grow, right? It's like, what's the phrase? It's like, where attention goes, energy flows.
mm,
And so like if you have a fear response and you just never listen to it, you don't give it power over you, you're
mhm.
not ruminating on it, it'll dissipate, just like anything else.
And I think a lot of people talk about what that means, but more in an abstracty way. If you have the words for it, what does that actually look like when you let go of fear? Is it that these thoughts come in so much and then you say, I'm going to take up a different activity? Is it you journal, or like, how do you actually
No,
let go?
yeah.
What's the practicalness of this?
This is a good question. I think most people don't understand what it means to accept something or what it means to let go. Because like what I've come to through my own experience is that if you have a fear coming up, if you have to accept it, is to feel it as fully as possible.
Mm,
is to come down into your body. Where does it feel? Where is it located? And just breathe and just feel it. If your thoughts start thinking about it, like, oh, it's fear because of this and this and the whole narrative, come back to the experience in the body.
How do you do that?
With your attention, you focus on it.
I almost, I want to push you because I would say it's focusing on the breath, but it's like, I feel like your brain fights you. Like you say, oh, I'm going to focus on this. And then you're thinking about yourself. And then like in 2 seconds before you even realize, your brain has gone back to the rumination.
I see. This is where meditation comes in. I might be
the
biased.
practice.
I've been a daily meditator since I was 18.
Yeah, mindfulness. We're back to mindfulness.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why, like, having the ability to maintain your attention on something and not let it get pulled off right away, I think is an essential life skill. And I guess it might be necessary here because, like, for me, it's just a matter of just like relaxing, settling, feeling into my kind of chest, heart, abdomen area, and just breathing and keeping my attention there. It's almost like I'm anchored here and the emotions are just doing their thing. And I'm just it's like, maybe I'll come up, well, then back down. And then after a while, it'll go away. And I've had that happen many times. Okay.
And so at that time, you're focusing on your breath? Are you focusing on where's your head at that point? Is it just blank? I'm asking you what meditation is like for you.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to use words for these things that are, practical and digestible for someone who doesn't do meditation on their daily life walk.
For example, if I were to ask you, like, what does your foot feel like right now? You'll be able to tell me, right? What does your hand feel like? What does your thigh feel like? So then it's like, what does this emotion feel like? And just trying to find that sensation and then just feeling it. Just trying to like, oh, like what shape is it? Is it heavy? Is it hot? Is it warm? Is it cold? And just trying to feel it with your attention. No, then just staying with it. And then you'll notice the more you stay with it, the less intense it is. And soon it'll disappear like a cloud that just like dissipates.
Right. And I think that's also the objective sense, right? Again, like kind of what we talked about earlier of looking at the emotion, recognizing that emotion is not you, that does not define you, that is not who you are and who you will be in the future. This is a moment that is occurring, and we can see it in all of its intensity. We don't want to stop feeling our feet. We don't want to stop feeling our hands, nor do we want to stop feeling these emotions. But we also equally don't say that I am my foot. It sounds even silly to say it, but like when you focus on your feet, you don't suddenly become your feet, unless maybe you're tripping, which at that point, like let's reground. But you recognize that that's an aspect of you, not all of you. And I think that if we took more of that perspective to our thoughts, we might be able to look at them in less of a strictly pure response, but maybe more of the subjective pulled back sense.
Totally.
It's like, I love every conversation I'm going to have on this podcast going to come back to mindfulness. I think at its core of just like recognizing how to be with our brain and how to be in existence with ourselves in a way that doesn't negate the thoughts that are going on there, but really like sits with them.
Totally. I mean, at the end of the day, mindfulness is just a way of using our ability for self-awareness to navigate life, right? It's just a way of being conscious and present and not getting lost with everything that's happening. Another way to say it is like, if you're in mindfulness, your actions that you take are going to be proactive and not reactive. Because if you're in mindfulness, you'll notice something pulling at you, and then you're like, oh, like you're going to choose to go with it or not. Whereas if you're in reactivity mode, something happens and oh, boom, you're there. Boom, you're there. You're not kind of stabilized within yourself.
Right.
And so then you just become this externally driven machine that has no internal autonomy, right? So I think mindfulness is almost like a necessary precondition for true autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, the Yoga Sutras has this, I don't know if it's a metaphor, not necessarily an allegory. The Yoga Sutras have this metaphor of our existence in our mind as if there's this river and it has all these waves and it's moving and the water's all chaotic and choppy. And you try to look into the river and see your reflection, and what you see is the chaos. You don't actually see yourself. But, just like the water of our mind, when we really calm our thoughts and it becomes such a slick, calm water, you're able to look into it and then see who you are. And so when our brain's getting pulled in all these different ways, you can think of that kind of as like the chaos of the water. Of course, you're going to look into that, respond in a way that is reactive, and that's not really going to reflect who you are at your core. It's going to reflect the chaos versus if we take a moment to see these thoughts, recognize that we can still keep the water calm, see who we are, and then respond. It's just a whole different thing. But I mean, easier said than done.
It's a lifelong practice for sure.
Yeah. They say that it's kind of like a muscle. The more that you work it, the more it
Yep,
becomes a
it
part of your
definitely is.
normal. And I think that science is really fascinating, the science of mindfulness and meditation, and how we're learning that, I think there's studies talking about when you do more mindfulness, that area of your brain increases.
Which one?
Something I look to you as
Maybe.
if you know all the science research that
Could be the insula. So the insula is a brain region involved in bodily kind of sensations.
Mm,
And a lot of mindfulness practice is focused on the body, typically, although that's not all of mindfulness. But I think their insula is bigger in meditators, which means they have a greater connection to their bodily sensations.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
but it's interesting. Like, I think the research focuses on mindfulness for the body because that's the easiest. But I think mindfulness for thoughts and emotions is harder. You need like an advanced meditator to do that, because you can't just get random undergrads and say like, hey, like meditate and be non-judgmentally and non-reactively aware of your thoughts.
Right. And then how do you measure that?
Exactly.
You can't. I mean, can you? I don't.
I mean, for that you need experienced meditators. You just have to take what they say is true, right?
Yeah.
Basically. But,
Which
yeah.
has its own problems. I think that, Western society really wants the control group, placebo, and especially when in terms of funding to do this more kind of research. I mean,
Totally. It'll
I'm
happen.
I'm gonna wait for your research study one day of mindfulness meditation and good and challenging trips. See if they have a
that would
difference.
be
I'd
cool.
love to see that one day.
Totally. Yeah, one day it'll happen, I'm sure.
Yeah, this has been really lovely. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I feel like we had a great conversation about psychedelics and mindfulness. I'm always happy to have those.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. No, it's been a lot of fun. It is a more free-flowing conversation than most of my podcast interviews, and it's like a lot of fun.
Good. I'm really glad. Well, thank you so much.
Cool. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, then subscribe for new episodes released every Wednesday, and follow us on Instagram at Modern Anarchy Podcast, where we open up a dialogue about all of these topics. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. And a special thanks to one of my favorite artists, Yor Smith, for the intro and outro song to this show.